At that time, which was around 2006, we made probably the most important decision, which was to develop a profound understanding of our business processes. Since it was clear that such an effort would require the buy-in from the entire organization, the transformation really started with the executive management getting behind the effort. To get the buy-in, the business case was actually quite straightforward. It was clear that we could only improve our business performance when we had a clear understanding of our processes and as long as we made sure that the processes were actually implemented as planned. Our process understanding had to become the guideline for the architecture, not just for this project, but also for the future activities, for optimization and for end-user training. Hence, the first step was to start with BPM and select a process platform. Our initial search was focused on UML tools, since we wanted to be able to use the same tool for process documentation and our IT architecture. We realized quickly that business would have hard times using UML, because it was too IT-centric to be useful. We came very quickly across the ARIS Platform from IDS Scheer. What we liked about ARIS was that it provided us with tools to cover both the business and the IT view, which for us was the most important prerequisite. Plus, IDS Scheer offered also a comprehensive set of methodologies to help with the documentation of our processes. This first phase was already an eye-opener, because the organization as a whole was forced to think about processes. We discovered a lot of opportunities for optimization right from the start. Many users were doing things that could be automated, but nobody was aware of it because it was assumed this would be part of the daily job. During the process documentation, we also linked individual process steps to the relevant functions in the application source, but we didn't go any further then. From the analysis, it was getting clear that now we had created a new situation that we needed to address. The key question was now how we could take these process models and get the IT in sync with the new automated processes we wanted to implement. The gap between process models and application source was just too large. We studied the market for suitable solutions to fill that gap. We looked at a number of tools that proposed to generate BPL from the process models, but all these required a separate process engine, an enterprise service bus, and an underlying application server. This would have added a lot of complexity to the architecture, and since we wanted to reuse as much as possible from our previous application, using such an approach was out of the question. Looking at the established approaches in the market, we were always left with the same gap between models and code. Eventually, we came across E2E and saw the early stages of the ARIS Bridge integration. What appealed to us was the fact that E2E's model execution approach would allow us to use models end-to-end, from top-down and from design into production, so we could go straight from process to application. Initially, we were quite skeptic about the marketing promise that the approach required really no programming. We knew that large companies such as UBS, DKSH and Swisscom were already using the approach, but still implementing a complete software application without code or code generation sounded unbelievable. So we decided to test the E2E Bridge by doing a 2-day proof of concept in-house. And what can I say? We found indeed that we required no programming to implement business logic or to access our backend database. It was still a tough decision to use the approach for our project. After all, we had no in-house experience with model execution. And although we did no longer doubt the technical capabilities of the E2E Bridge, there was still the question if our organization would be able to cope with the new approach. We knew that the benefits could potentially be huge, so we decided eventually to mitigate the risk and go for a more extensive pilot, where we took a core functionality of the new ReCash and implemented it using the E2E Bridge. At the same time, we ran a pilot to test all non-functional requirements, such as transaction handling, exception handling and security. Our own developers had no prior UML knowledge, so we sent them to a computer school for a 3-day introduction to UML, and then we added 2 days of training to use the E2E Bridge. After that, they were able to implement the 2 pilots with occasional guidance of E2E and an external consultant. At this stage, we had finally eliminated all doubts that we were able to use the new approach within our organization, and we began to implement the new application. We did this by using the process documentation we had done before in ARIS. This was representing the as-is process, which we used to define the new automated target process. During this phase, we also made a detailed analysis of the existing source code, so we could eventually combine the technical functionality of ReCash with the new process design. This was a highly iterative approach. You see a sample of the original source code here. And over here you see the final result showing the executable UML model. As a matter of risk reduction, we were very careful about choosing the right process. The main goal was to find one that has as little dependency on other processes as possible. Our cash flow process had all these properties. With only about 2% external dependencies, it was ideal as the target for the first project. What we learned during that transformation phase was enormous, and it was encouraging to see how much we were able to control the quality of the overall outcome. To produce good models, we were literally forced to think in small modular units. With traditional programming, it's very easy to produce thousands of lines of code and just insert an if-then-else statement to add new functionality. If you do that with models, the complexity and lack of structure is going to be obvious, even to a non-technical person. As a result, we spent more time with the design than originally planned, but it paid off immensely by leading us to much higher levels of reusability. If we look back at the original target architecture we had in mind before starting with process thinking, it is quite surprising how different the actual application design turned out to be. Originally, we had put the user as the guiding principle for our SOA design. Now compare that to what we eventually ended up with. The architecture is much simpler, and instead of the end user, the process is now the guiding principle. This had quite fundamental implications, also for how the user is being involved. Before, we tried to cram as much functionality as possible into the user interface. Now, with every process step, the user has only access to exactly the amount of functionality that's required to complete the next process step. From an implementation perspective, this means that instead of one complex client, we now have many simple clients. Of course, this means initially more effort on the IT side, but for the end user, it has become much easier to learn how to use the clients. Because today, even an apprentice can learn to use it after 30 minutes, whereas before, even after 3 months, it was difficult to use the client effectively. The results we have obtained so far are quite impressive.